I suppose at some point you get so big you just stop caring that you can look into a camera and just lie, just spout bullshit. As if the public doesn't necessarily know, as if all of you are playing along in a game where you have no clothes on, running, which is balls jiggling on stage, unabashed, as if you were wearing a full suit and so forth. Obama joins Joe Biden for one of these theatrical performances of swinging dick production, in which case Obama gets on and just lies. Lies so much, trying to rehabilitate and whitewash George Bush and his record, meaning Obama's record and George Bush's record, two war criminals that honestly deserve to be in The Hague. Let's be very clear, let's be very honest. I'm not talking about how you feel about Obama. I keep saying we love our monsters. But let's just be very clear, they are indeed monsters. If you were living in any of those countries at the end of the boot of America, be it Iraq, be it Afghanistan, be it Syria, or for that matter, be it Libya, your life has dramatically changed for the worse. And it's their fault. 500,000 people died in that Syrian war. If you want to go to Bush, 1 million people died in that Iraq war. If you want to go to Clinton, 500,000 kids died as a result of those sanctions that George Bush put on Iraq. Bill Clinton put on Iraq. We love our monsters. Let's just be very clear, they are indeed monsters. And any notion that you will try to rehabilitate George Bush is utterly and entirely obscene, even if you're trying to do that just to go after one Donald Trump. That is exactly what Obama does here. He looks into the camera, whitewashes, gaslights, and lies through his teeth entirely. Welcome to the soapbox. You're going to love this. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is a Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you the opportunity for allowing me to do what I do. I saw this video and I was apoplectic. I'm not a fan of Obama, and anybody that knows me pretty much knows that, especially when the subject takes place. Many African Americans love him. And when those African Americans have a conversation with me, they leave very cross at me because they don't understand why I get apoplectic in having these conversations, especially if you're going to whitewash his record or if you're not going to care about the people he murdered. Full stop. Obama deserves to be in The Hague every bit as much as Bush. And the only reason you may not think that is because you don't give a shit about what happens abroad and the boot of America as it kills, murders, maims, burns to death people abroad, or for that matter, starve to death. Right now, Donald Trump is trying to starve the Syrian government into submission. So be aware of what we do. And if you don't believe the value of a life equals to the value of a life, then fair enough. You can say, I don't care that all of those people got murdered by Obama as he went about his foreign policy aims. I do. And so when I make that point from the standpoint that life matters. And if life indeed matters, then what he does abroad matters every bit as much as what he does here. Let's take a listen to Obama and Biden lie and whitewash and try to rehabilitate George Bush in the process.
The foundation stones, the institutions that we had in place were still more or less intact. My predecessor, who I disagreed with on a whole host of issues, still had a basic regard for the rule of law and the importance of our institutions' democracy. On the world stage, there was still a sense that...
I don't know who sneezed, but it was on time. It was perfect. Perfect timing. Bullshit. Bullshit. Sorry. Pick that up. You got that? You picked that up? My bad. I didn't mean to do that. It just came out of me at that moment. Bullshit. Yeah, that's the correct response. They kept talking, but as long as they got that part in, bullshit. I don't know if the guy said bullshit, but you might as well have said bullshit. George Bush had some response for the rule of law. Put a pin in that. Let's keep going. I want you to hear more of this. This gets better. I'm going to rewind this back. I want Obama to say this again, straight face, looking at the camera.
Of our institutions' democracy. On the world stage, there was still a sense that America needed to lead, and that leadership meant that as imperfect as we might be, there were certain ideals and values that we were going to aspire to and advance, and that we cared about human rights, and we cared about battling against the oppression of peoples in distant lands, and that we tried to uphold both in our own country but around the world certain core principles around rule of law and the universal dignity of people and the need for us to provide assistance to those who are suffering either from natural catastrophes or because of underdevelopment, a sense that our alliances were important and that we should stand up for democracy and human rights. And so as challenging as those times were, and as much of a slog as it was to yank the economy out of the economic crisis that it was in, and in some ways things were tougher in terms of the financial system.
All right, a few of those things that we need to unpack. America needed to lead. There was an understanding America needed to lead. George Bush had a basic understanding of the rule of law. We cared about human rights. We cared about oppression of people in distant lands, and we had a universal dignity of people. So where do you want to start? Let's start with George Bush. George Bush lied, and in that lie, got this country into a war where we spent $7 trillion, killed 1 million people, and got 4,000 American lives also lost. On top of that, we also intruded upon Afghanistan. And in intruding upon Afghanistan, laid the basis basically for the next X number of years, where basically that Obama went into one country after the next, like 7 wars, extending it. George Bush tortured people. George Bush created a gulag on the coast outside of our laws, on the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And wireless surveillance. What the fuck are you talking about? All of those things were illegal. Torture, Obama may not realize this, was against the law. Obama gave a pass to George Bush and his torture regime. Right here, Bush war crimes. Obama Justice Department grants final immunity to Bush's CIA tortures. CIA tortures. Basically, the cases that were going through, Obama gave a pass. On top of giving a pass, hid the torture reports. And more importantly, did not prosecute or push to prosecute George Bush for war crimes. George Bush invaded a country on a war, on a lie. That's against our laws. We typically, at the very least, are not necessarily allowed to do that. Did George Bush know he was lying? Yes or no? Nancy Pelosi said she knew he was lying. All of these things bespeaks of somebody who is basically perfectly willing to flagrantly violate the law. I mean, what are you talking about? Is torture against the law? Yeah or nay? That's a yes or no. Was the mass surveillance against the law or not? Yeah or nay? That was against our laws. Was it illegal for George Bush to go into Iraq, basically lying to Congress in order to do so? Yay or nay? Which of these things bespeaks of somebody who is aware of this notion of law? Even from the standpoint of the drone bombings, when George Bush was in those countries, killing all of those people with those drones, was that against the law? Yay or nay? And as we talk about this, we also need to talk about Obama's culpability in regards to his flagrant disregard for the law that was every bit as much as voracious as George Bush's. In addition to basically giving a pass to war crimes, 80% of the people Obama was murdering were civilians. Put that in perspective. You're not even hitting terrorists at that point. You're just murdering civilians, and every so often, you get what you consider to be a terrorist. That number, by the way, gets worse when you get into some of the other countries where we don't necessarily have good reporting. Here's another thing. Obama, despite lying about the whole boots on the ground stuff, drops $1 billion, if not more, into trying to knock down the government of Syria. Is that against the law or not? Same thing, shadow wars. Obama escalates wars in Africa, something that is not even in the eyesight of most Americans. Meaning not only were we responsible for 500,000 deaths in the civil war we created and propagated in Syria, not to mention the war we were fighting in with proxies, we also did the same thing in Libya. Is that against the law or not? They're selling slaves right now in Libya. And if it wasn't for the intervention of Russia into the Syrian war, you would have had terrorists, head choppers, and rapists basically running wild over that country. Every bit as much as you have it in Libya. How is that freedom and democracy? How is it freedom and democracy if indeed the people who you're supporting are rapists and terrorists? Explain to me how? How? But this is what Obama was basically doing across the world. Tillerson memo. Right here. May 17th. This was given to Trump. Basically, they were trying to explain to Tillerson. I'm sorry, this was given to Tillerson, Rex Tillerson. They were trying to explain to Tillerson what U.S. foreign policy is really about. Bare bones. May 17th memo reads like a crash course for a businessman turned diplomat, and its conclusions offer a starkly realistic vision that the United States should use human rights as a club against its adversaries like Iran, China, and North Korea, while giving a pass to repressive allies like the Philippines, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Allies should be treated differently and better than adversaries. Otherwise, we end up with more adversaries and fewer allies. Is that not U.S. foreign policy? Has nothing to do with human rights. When Obama used that talking point, it doesn't mean anything. It all depends on what U.S. interest is. And depending upon U.S. interest is, the U.S. acts in its own interest. If it means 500,000 Syrians die, then 500,000 Syrians die. If it means that they're selling slaves in Libya, then they're selling slaves in Libya. If it means that Iraq turns into basically a fire pit with 1 million dead, then Iraq turns into a fire pit with 1 million dead. Same thing with Afghanistan. Same thing with Africa. Same thing with Honduras. Same thing. You get my point. Country after country after country, this notion of freedom and democracy. At which point does it look like freedom and democracy when you have terrorists and rapists and head choppers basically running wild in a country that is on fire? Get out of here. Just stop. Just stop. It's gross. One last point. The murdering of children. Obama murdered Americans and then took the extravagant step of having Eric Holder to basically explain that judicial purview can be done in the executive branch. And just because you need a certain degree of jurisprudence, it doesn't necessarily mean that needs to be done by the judicial branch. Now, the argument was being made when he murdered Al-Awlaki and he murdered his kid. So both were killed in drone bombings. Al-Awlaki committed no crime. He was not charged with any crime. American, and yet whacked. Very little explanation, very little needed to make that argument or anybody going after him because he's Obama after all. So nobody ever made a huge deal out of it. A few people bitched. But ultimately, the president has just murdered an American having due process entirely within the executive branch. Can you imagine if Trump used that power? Whatever you want to think about Al-Awlaki, he committed no crime, and his child certainly committed no crime. That murder was called collateral damage. Think about what we're saying for the moment. That was illegal, and the justification of it basically was weak at best, and yet that was what Obama did. The murdering of all of those people, despite lying to the public saying there was no boots on the ground, be it in Syria, be it in Libya, be it in Africa. Both of these men, Obama and Bush, deserve to be in The Hague. And the idea that Obama is out here making this argument, whitewashing his illegalities in that office and George Bush's illegalities in that office is traumatically sad. Fact of the matter is, they have ignored international law entirely. And from the standpoint of human rights, that's laughable. You realize the fires that the United States set in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in those countries basically flooded Europe with refugees, people who were fleeing the war zones that the United States was creating, destabilizing European politics. That didn't sound like a safe haven. That didn't sound like a fight for human rights. That sounded like you were murdering a lot of people and causing a lot of havoc and setting fires around the globe. You should be ashamed of yourself. If you had any level of shame, you should be ashamed of yourself. The idea that you will rehabilitate Bush in order to go after Trump, and for that matter, rehabilitate yourself in your own illegalities. The American public may give you a pass on the people you've murdered, but I know your sins. And every time you come out here and give some stupid ass whitewashing, gaslighting conversation like this, I will be here to call your sins out. Like, share, and subscribe.